All right. All right, everybody ready to get started? Press the raise hand button if you are. One wasn't talking to you, Jack. All right. I'm not sure if the names are backward or not. Is it Wallace Faith or Faith Wallace?
It's Faith Wallace. Faith, are you here?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay, cool. All right, welcome everyone to the LD topic lecture. I'm Ian Lowery, as you might remember from the staff introduction. So, in this lecture, we're going to be going over the basics of compulsory voting, which is the resolution that's, I'm not sure, Jackie, is it already chosen for, I know we're doing it here. But,
No, it's one of the three options.
okay. All right, so you all know I'm not going to reinvent the wheel here. I'm Ian, coached here at GMU for 2 years, debated here for 4 years. The big concepts that I want to make sure you all leave this lecture understanding are what compulsory voting means and what are its implications, what it looks like in the real world, the general pros and cons of compulsory voting, and also some ideas for how you might want to frame your case on either side of the issue. All right, so let's start. Compulsory voting and you. What is it? How does it affect you? We'll find out. All right. So compulsory voting is basically a policy that mandates registration and participation in elections. It doesn't always mandate registration. For some countries, only mandate that if you are already registered to vote, you have to participate. So we'll go over some examples of that. It already exists in over 35 countries. A couple of examples that we're going to go over are compulsory voting in Australia, Brazil, Belgium, and Luxembourg. So let's jump into that. All right, so compulsory voting in Australia. There we go. All right, so here's basically what it looks like. Voting is compulsory for all state and federal elections. Elections are always held on a Saturday to make sure that as many people as possible can participate. It is enforced using fines of, what was the exact amount? I think about $10, 10 Australian dollars per missed ballot. And it has an average voter turnout of about 90%. Now, there are ways to appeal. If you missed an election, you can prove that you had some reason, in which case you won't suffer any penalty. But generally, the fines are enforced, and you have to vote in every state and federal election, which happens about every 2 years. All right, compulsory voting in Brazil. Now, voting is compulsory for all literate citizens from 18 to 70 years old, including individuals who live out of the country. One attached policy to compulsory voting is, in order to register to vote in Brazil, you have to take a literacy test. Now, illiterate citizens can also vote. However, for illiterate citizens, voting is voluntary, not compulsory. Right? Elections are typically held every 4 years, as is here in the US, and the average voter turnout is about 80%. Oh, and for context, in the 2016 United States general election, we had a voter turnout of about 55%. So on average, most countries with compulsory voting have an additional about 25 to 30% voter participation here in the US. All right, next, voting in Belgium. Every registered voter must be present at their polling station on election day. Now, this is slightly different because there's nothing written in the law that you actually have to cast a ballot. However, you must simply be present at the voting station. But absences written into the law are subject to some sort of prosecution. For the first 3 missed ballots, there's simply a fine. However, after 3, once you've missed 4 elections, there are some more harsh penalties. For example, you are taken out of the voter registry for 10 years if you miss 4 elections. So you can't vote for 4 years. That also has implications for your ability to run for public office. So if you're taken from the voter registry in Belgium, you can't be elected to any sort of public office, which for a lot of people, people that work in Belgium, I think about 20% work for the government. So that's a very harsh penalty for them. And they also have a voter turnout of about 90%. Next is Luxembourg. All right, it's compulsory for all citizens aged 18 to 75 who live in Luxembourg. It doesn't apply to individuals who live out of the country. Now, one slight difference for Luxembourg is that the penalty, while written into law that you will be fined, is rarely ever enforced. And yet they still have a 90% voter turnout. Right. One reason I think that's interesting and something that you should think about is if you would like to argue certain additional policies that may come after the implementation of compulsory voting, or you could make an argument that additional policies would come along with that policy. That allows you to get creative in terms of how exactly you think compulsory voting would play out in the US, which would give you opportunities to sort of preempt or potentially what we call in policy debate, maybe spike out of certain arguments the con might make if you are arguing on the pro side of compulsory voting. So this is definitely a topic that I think gives you all some flexibility to be creative about the exact way in which you want to propose your case. So keep that in mind. All right. Next, we're going to go over the general pros and cons. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the talking points of both sides of the issue. All right, so for compulsory voting, there's no question, it's empirically proven to drastically increase voter turnout. And the argument there is that more turnout leads to a more fair and equitable democratic process that actually reflects the will of almost all citizens. On the opposite side of that, people who argue in favor of voluntary voting, obviously just saying you can vote at your own discretion, they argue that it allows individuals to practice their civil liberty by refusing not to vote. They argue that it can act as a form of protest to some sort of problem with the electoral process. So, for example, younger people tend not to vote. A lot of the issues with feeling as though politicians don't necessarily cater to them and their viewpoints and beliefs. So a lot of people arguing that choosing not to engage in the process is their own way of sending a signal, which is just as legitimate as casting out. All right, what that means. So for the pros of compulsory voting, so if you're on the pro side, your general arguments will be in the vein of in a voter turnout. You could argue that that leads to a decrease of voter suppression, i.e., the trend for some individuals to not have as fair a shot of engaging in the electoral process, as well as that increasing political engagement leads to an increase of political knowledge, which could lead to better outcomes. There actually is some evidence in surveys that have been taken that show that compulsory voting leads to people becoming more informed about the political process, which is actually a direct counter argument that typically comes up on the con side of this debate. All right, so on the con, a lot of people argue that compulsory voting would lead to an influx of uninformed voters. So on the opposite side, they argue that that could lead to net negative political outcomes by mandating that everyone engage in the political process. The right to refusal, that's sort of a reiteration of the arguments I made under the talking points, that some people believe that they should have the right to refuse to engage in the process as a form of protest to the process that sends a legitimate signal. And unfair punishment ties into the voter suppression argument. Basically, if compulsory voting is implemented, but nothing is changed in the way of allowing more people whose votes are suppressed in the status quo to engage in the process, there is an argument then that those people will be unfairly punished by the policy, whether that punishment be a fine or whatever. All right. Next, I'm going to go over some framing issues that I think would be interesting to integrate into any case that you construct. All right, so on the pro side, some interesting opportunities for framing issues could make is firstly, values that I think would work very well for this case would be things in the vein of democracy, equality, social justice, or social equity. And criterions that I think would work well with those policies and lead to an interesting discussion would be what I'm calling here civic responsibility. I was going to call that civic duty, but something that I had in mind is a lot of people don't like hearing the civic duty argument, right? It's your civic duty to vote. It's something we've all heard before. What I think would be an interesting spin on that argument is rather than just saying, oh, you should vote because the country allows you to, because people fought for your ability to do so, you could sort of use a lot of the rhetoric that's very ingrained in our social atmosphere right now around things like public health and COVID-19 to make an argument along the lines of, even if you don't want to vote, you don't want to engage in the democratic process because you don't think any candidate is appealing to you, I think it would be interesting for the pro to make an argument along the lines of we should mandate that people vote because then that will lead to them casting ballots that they think would be good for the community as a whole, right? For society as a whole. And that can lead to a net better society as well. Also, a criterion of equal opportunity works very well with the equality and social justice values because you can argue that with compulsory voting, that will lead to sort of tangential policies that make it easier for people to vote, thus decreasing voter suppression. Some examples that I can give you for that would be, as we said, almost all countries with compulsory voting have elections on a weekend. We don't do that here in the United States. A lot of people have argued that we should to make it easier to vote. People have argued that we should make election days a federal holiday as a way to make it easier for people to vote. There are also things like voting by mail that a lot of people argue that we should implement. Actually, of the 35 or 30 plus countries that have compulsory voting, a large number of them allow vote by mail as well. So those are examples of things that you could argue would be attached or would follow on after compulsory voting that would lead to more social equity, more equal opportunity for all people to have their voice heard in the electoral process. All right, so on the con side of this issue, people who would argue in favor of voluntary voting instead of compulsory voting, I think democracy also works well for this. The reason for that is, remember, on the voluntary voting side, you're making the argument that refusing to cast a ballot is sort of also a part of the democratic process because you are sending a signal that no one candidate has appealed to you enough to make you go out and cast your vote, right? So using that definition of what it means to choose not to engage in the electoral process means that you are in your own way attempting to help democracy or be a part of the process by choosing not to be a part of the process, right? And the argument is that that should be recognized as legitimate. Other values that I think work well are freedom and civil liberty, both sort of in the same vein that you should allow people to sort of have their individual right to make the choice of whether or not they want to in that process or not. Criterions that I think work well to meet those values would be in the vein of autonomy, basically just allowing people to have self-governance of their own body without, interference from the government in any way. Personal agency, for a lot of the same reasons. And an interesting idea that I have would be making something like civil disobedience a value criterion, right? This is something that if you've been debating LD for a few years, you might have debated on the civil disobedience good bad topic. I think they've done that like twice now over the last couple of years. An interesting direction I think you could take by doing that is you could argue that by allowing people to resist the process as their own form of protest, that leads to one, increased civil liberties for all people, increased freedom, obviously, but then that sort of allows you to craft the narrative of the debate as a whole, right? That democracy is both your choice to engage in the process and your choice not to. And by being civilly disobedient, right? That is just as much a part of the process as choosing not to engage. All right, that's all for the PowerPoint. I actually made a Kahoot if you all want to do it. And when I say if you all want to do it, that means you all have to do it. It's not an option. But before we do that, if you have any questions, we can do a quick question and response period. Raise your hand or type a question in the chat if you have one. You got some hands? All right. Is it Jane?
Um, Hello?
It's S.
Hello?
It's SJ. I go by SJ.
Could you say that again?
I go by SJ. It's just 2 letters.
Oh, SJ.
Mhm.
Okay, gotcha. What's your question?
What's a value criterion? I'm new to Lincoln Douglas, so.
Oh, yeah, totally. So a value criterion is basically, let me go to the slide. A value criterion is basically a framing device that you tell the judge how to determine what best meets the value. So if the value is democracy, right, you could argue that your criterion to determine which case, the pro or the con, meets that value is something like giving people individual autonomy, giving people personal agency. So in LD debate, there are sort of 2 framing devices that you use. The value, which is basically you telling the judge, this is sort of the most important moral or ethical concept that we should determine who wins or loses by. And then there's the value criterion, which is sort of a lower framing issue that the judge should evaluate how you meet that value by.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense? Jackie, was that a good explanation?
Yeah, that's going to lead us up to, we're going to cover that a lot in the afternoon lab. So SJ, if you were still a little confused, no worries.
All right, next, Nicole, did you have a question?
Yeah, so you were talking about how we can discuss policies that would go after the implementation of compulsory voting, but I remember being in debate tournaments where they just said you have to debate on what is happening now. So I'm a little confused. Are we only going to be debating on whether it should be compulsory because this or that, or can we discuss different versions of it?
All right, I think you could discuss different versions of it. The distinction there is you would simply be making an argument that based on what we see in the status quo, you can argue that if compulsory voting were implemented, it would be implemented in a certain way that it would have, X attached policy. So it's not necessarily you just individually deciding that, we do compulsory voting and we do literacy tests. Don't say that at all. Even if you could, don't say that. That wouldn't be a good idea. So for example, like the penalty, right? Just saying compulsory voting, good, bad, you aren't taking a stance on what if your opponents ask you what happens if you violate compulsory voting. In the status quo, we see that most countries have fines as the penalty. You can say like the penalty will be a fine. That is you clarifying something about the policy that is based in the status quo. And similarly, you can argue that based on how we see other countries implement compulsory voting, if we adopted that, we would also adopt that elections would be held on weekends because that's how every other country does it. That make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Any other burning questions? If not, we'll do a quick Kahoot. No? Okay. I will post the link in the chat in 1 second. All right. All right, there's the link in the chat. And I'll share my screen so you can see the code.
Ah, well, let me copy and paste.
Oh, what just happened there?
Just share a tab, not a screen.
Oh, okay.
And then for someone who said it won't let me copy paste, it did let me just use it as a hyperlink.
Oh, it just won't let me click on it in general. Like I can click on Ian Lab. It's okay. I'll be able to type it out pretty fast.
I can email it to you.
No, it's fine. I just have like 12 FOB7 left.
Gotcha. You're a fast typer.
Can you email? Because it says it doesn't exist.
All right, 1 second. I'm still trying to figure out this share screen situation, but I'll repost it or see if there's another way. There we go. Still the wrong thing. There we go.
So if you all are still trying to figure out, the easiest way to do it is what Lily said, to just do kahoot.it, and then the code that Ian has on the screen, 3854377, is what you would put in.
All right, to make it a little easier, if you're in now, just press the raise hand button. So
Everyone's in.
Oh, everyone's in? Okay, cool, cool.
Yeah, Faith, I think, had to leave, but everybody else is here.
Okay, nice. Let's get started then. Oh, so you all know, my Kahoots are a little different. You know, we're going to talk about the lecture, but I also like to test your knowledge of like recent events, meme knowledge, pop culture. It all goes in there. All right, nice. Next. Yeah, it was Brazil. Okay. In fairness, it was on the slide, but I forgot to highlight that in the lecture. All right. Yeah, that's right. Luxembourg, they have it written into law that you'll be fined if you don't participate in elections, but they are known for never enforcing it. It hasn't been enforced since, I believe, the 1960s or something like that. There are also other countries who don't enforce it at all through a different means. I forgot to bring this up during the lecture too. Some countries simply have it written into law that all citizens will participate, but there is no established penalty for not doing it. So that's another way that you could argue that the United States could implement compulsory voting, but you could technically argue that there should just be no penalty if people don't do it. All right.
You kind of gave that one away.
Come on, it's soft.
A little bit. Okay.
Kanye.
Joe Rogan.
These kids are so quick on the draw.
Yeah, they know that pop culture knowledge. I'll give you all that. Yep. All right. We all understand why that is. Civil liberty is the idea that you should be able to do what you want without being impeded by the government. Compulsory voting is kind of the opposite of that. The 2020 Grammys. So you all know. Yep, it was Billy. Lizzo was also nominated. You know, Billy got the dub. Yeah. Increasing voter suppression would not
Oh
be an
man, I
argument
didn't
in
even see
favor.
that option.
Yeah, voter suppression is decreasing voter suppression is an argument in favor of compulsory voting. Increasing voter knowledge, like I said, there are studies that argue that voter knowledge goes up with compulsory voting. So that would most likely be sort of an advantage for the pro side of that debate. right? I'm tricking y'all up with the wording here. If you want voluntary voting, then you say that your right to or not to vote can be a form of protest. If someone who supports compulsory voting might be more likely to say that not voting is anti-democratic. Yep. It was both. Picking either would have been correct, right? Because I just realized that the wording of the question, if you'd picked compulsory or voluntary voting, you wouldn't technically have been wrong either. So, for the sake of fairness, I would have made any of them correct. Oh, I didn't say this in the lecture. You're going to have to guess here.
Wait. Oh my.
Yeah, that one's on me. I didn't tell y'all this. Yeah, so on average, over the last few years, the number of countries with compulsory voting policies have actually been decreasing. A lot of countries that have had them for a long time have been decided to abolish that policy. All right, we ready? We ready for the big questions now? This isn't big questions debate, but I got a big question for y'all.
Wait, no, this is unfair. Bro, what?
Ah, I'm so
Hey,
proud of y'all. Y'all know. Y'all know. That's the correct answer.
Nah, Suge Knight
Absolutely.
hunted him down after he ran away. The real question is who killed 3 Pac?
Yeah. Good work though, and it's the truth. I would never lie to you. I want you to know that. Ian, Bishop, I would never lie to any of you.
wait a minute.
Maybe that's the only lie he's told so far.
Yeah, I'm scared. Oh my god, those mind games.
Hey, look, this is a life lesson for y'all. Trust no one, not even yourself. All right.
As somebody who knows nothing about culture.
All right. Is it Katya?
Yeah, it's Katya.
All right. You got first in the queue. You know what you win?
What?
Absolutely nothing. Woo! All right, yeah, so that was that. We got a little bit of time left. If you want, if I know a lot of you are in the novice lab, but if you have experience or you have ideas for how you might want to run this case, we can go over sort of any burning questions, any ideas for values, or how you might want to set up your pro or con case, if it's something that you want to think about now. If not, I don't know. We'll just hang out. Let me go through this to make sure there isn't any other big point that I forgot to tell y'all.
Ian, I'm actually fine with you ending here because I do have an assignment that I want them to work on before we start our 2 p.m. lab. And this is actually the perfect amount of time that they need to do the assignment. So,
Okay, cool.
okay,
All right.
so as you all know, as Ian started to kind of talk to you about, and we mentioned earlier, our topic for this session is going to be, in a democracy, there ought to be compulsory voting. Like voting ought to be compulsory. When we come back at 2 o'clock for our afternoon lab, we're going to start with a brainstorming session of what that topic means. So what I want you all to do over the next 20 or so minutes is I want you to do a little bit of independent research. And I want you to figure out as many arguments as you can in those 20 minutes for why and why not compulsory voting would be a good idea. You can also figure out what those terms mean. I want you to really break down the topic so when we have that brainstorming session, we're coming in with ideas, if that makes sense. Does anyone have clarification questions about what that means for you over the next 20 minutes? Okay, so you are, feel free to stay in this lab session or this session here. If you have questions while you're researching, I'm going to be online in here. But that is what I want you to work on now, is to kind of open up a Microsoft document and start doing some research on what this topic means and what arguments you can imagine would exist.
Okay, I'm out. See you, LD Lab. I'll see you next week or the Afro Pest lecture. Have fun.
Bye, Bishop. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Oh, also, Ian Lowry's nickname is Bishop. And if you all do a good job in lab today, I might tell you the story tomorrow for why.
The human chess piece.
Do we have to cite sources right now or anything?
I would say no, unless Jackie would say otherwise.
I was literally talking with my mic muted. I'm so annoyed at myself. I said I would, if you find hyperlinks, just put the hyperlinks underneath, just so that you have it for later. I'm not going to be like asking for it now, but if you find a really good article, you should obviously make sure that you have an opportunity to go back to it.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.